This is how to adjust the chain on a chopper or a Harley or some kind of cruiser type bike. You're going to need a motorcycle stand or some way of getting the rear wheel elevated, however you want to do that. Some guys would choose to strap somewhere to the frame and hoist it up to the rafters. I'm going to use a motorcycle jack. This particular chopper is really low to the ground. What I've done is put the front wheel up on the curb, and that'll give me a little bit more clearance to get my jack stand under. When you slide the jack stand under the bike, you want to make sure that you're not going to damage something. So look for any kind of lines or wires. Make sure it looks good around the shocks. Ideally straddle the shocks, and make sure it's back far enough that it'll lift the rear end and not the front end. Now that the jack stand is in place, that's solid, I know the bike's stable, the next thing I have to do is get at the axle adjusters, which are behind the axle covers. Now, depending on your model of bike or manufacturer, you could actually have exposed axle nuts. Every one is a little bit different. This particular one, I have to take axle covers off, and then the axle will be underneath that. There's my axle cover removed, and now I'll go to the other side and get that one too. Now, what you see on this particular chopper is there is a bolt that goes into both ends of the actual axle. So I'm going to start by loosening that, and then here's the axle adjusters you can see right in front of it. There's that side, now I'll get the other side. Now on this particular chopper, the brake caliper is mounted with the axle, and there's a bolt down here that you have to take loose before you can slide this whole assembly back. Each bike, again, may be different, but look at your brake mount and see if you have a bolt you have to loosen before you start doing this. Again, each model is going to be a little bit different, but most motorcycles have some kind of what we call an axle adjuster, and it's basically a threaded piece that goes into the swing arm, and you rotate that bolt. Some of them will have a jam nut on the inside. This particular one does not. We can see the chain's a little bit loose, right? So to tighten the chain, you need to move the whole axle back. So think about it this way, the chain's loose, right? And as the more you pull it back, it's gonna tighten it up, right? So think about it that way. So what that means is both bolts on both sides of the axle, you wanna move backward the same amount. So I know that I already have the two even, and it's centered in line with the front tire. All I need to do is move the same rotations on each side, and I know it will stay centered. So I'll go get my wrench, and I'm going to count how many flats. So I move it 1 flat, 2 flats. Okay, I went a full 6 flats, which is 1 complete rotation of that screw. Now if I look about in the middle of the chain, and it's just a little bit over that inch, it's about 1 3/8 inches, which is right about where we want it cold. So I'm happy with that. Now I'll go over and move the other side exactly 1 turn as well. Now if you have a modern sport bike, you can measure with ticks down here that they put, or the distance between the block and here. With choppers, if you do end up losing your count on that and you want to measure just to be sure, you can make a real simple tool with just a coat hanger and a little piece of tape or something on the end of it to measure. Unlike the sport bike, it's not good to measure in here because these things can deflect and it's just not as proper. So to do it right, you want to measure from the swing arm pivot back to the axle. So you put the front of it in the swing arm pivot point, and then use the tape to line up where it hits the center of the axle back here, and then just go do the same thing on the other side and make sure they're even. That loop in this wire frame is for clearing the license plate on the other side. Once you're sure you have the distance from the axle to the swing arm pivot the same on both sides, and your chain's the right gap, and again, each bike will have its own specs. Everything from torque of this to the chain sag to whatever else. On something with more suspension travel like the sport bike, you'll actually want to check the chain sag, usually with you sitting on the bike. Everyone's different. Read the manual, okay? Read the manual. But in general, I go for about 1 1/4 inch sag cold. This suspension is set up pretty stiff, so I'm not worried about a lot of deflection. But again, on a sport bike, you would definitely want to make sure that you're on it with your gear if that's what the book says. Now that everything's adjusted, all I gotta do is retighten the axle. Again, look at your manual and see what the proper torque is. Once you've tightened the axle on both sides if necessary, don't forget to go back and tighten your brake mount if you had to loosen one on your bike. Now that you know you have the axles even with the adjusters, the axles are tight, you have the brake mount tight if you had to loosen one, and now you just have to put the axle covers back on. I like to use a little bit of blue Loctite on the screws for these. Lock tight, lock washers, lock nuts. If you ride a Harley or a chopper, these things are your friends and keep parts from vibrating off. One other thing to note, depending on what kind of a chopper you have, this might be a time to look at your fender mounting. This particular chopper has a floating fender that floats with the wheel. In other words, it's mounted to the swing arm, not to the frame. So when the swing arm moves up and down, the fender moves with it, right? It's got a rigid link here. The reason this is important, because as your whole wheel moves backward, you may end up in a position where the tire no longer looks good in the fender. So at some point, as your tire moves back, you may have to loosen your fender and move it back to follow the wheel. Again, every chopper's different, but if you have a swing arm mounted fender, that may be something you need to look at too. And now you're ready to hit the streets and enjoy it. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to learn more about how to enjoy amazing machines like this.